How does this start in the family, first of all, Michael? Um, I'll start.
Well, of course, this would be, see, in the family dynamic, we've talked about the role of the superego, and but we passed by something very, very important and didn't really dwell on it that much. And that is that one of the main functions of the superego is to turn you into one of your parents or both. Otherwise, why go to the whole hassle of why would you interject their voices and their, from a very young age? Now, of course, temporally, the superego full development, say about 6 and 7, is the moment when you really leave this sort of matriarchal, the power of the mother, right? The archaic super dependence, and you move into more of an independent realm where, of course, you're going to meet with a lot of other people in society at large outside the family constellation. And that's where a lot of linguistic abilities, your knowledge about that there's a thing called death, which might have been hardly there before. It's there, but it's not as strong. You may have had a death of a grandparent or a death of a pet. But after 7 years old, the striking feeling that you too can perish, you see, is far stronger. So there's things that, and I'm talking very generally here, right? But in the previous, stages before the superego, you may have been abused as a child. So you may know a lot about death, and you may know a lot about threat, and you certainly may know a lot about the withholding of love. Right? And all these negatives, you may know a lot about pain. You may know a lot about want and suffering because the parents have constantly put you into these catch-22 situations, constantly been using these techniques of the double blind, as it's known, and really, really abused you, in the sense of crushing your will and your identity. We've talked about all of that. But how does one reconcile that with a major function of the superego, which is to embody the parents' image so that you become like them? That's what the whole thing is like underneath. How they actually are is kind of a separate thing. The first job is to make you like them so that you can be a parent yourself, right? So that you can be a human being. But the trouble is that if the parents are substandard, if they are not good people, not good human beings, then you're off to a bad start right away. You're embodying the imagos of people that are really pretty much, flunkies. They're distasteful and probably even very, very hypocritical and, for that matter, even evil. But say we don't go that far, but they're still sort of gross people. You're in trouble. Because without you even consciously wanting to, you are patterning yourself on them. Now, but to be more specific about it, what you're doing is you're patterning yourself on the power that they wielded. This is the concomitant of what's known as the identification with the object of your hate. It's a dynamic that I've spoken about a lot in my work. And that is that because you've been under this power dynamic, usually when I talk about it, it's about a daughter in relationship to the mother. But actually, for our purposes, it's both sexes, right? The child identifies with the awesome power of the parent that it hates. So why would you, when you say I hate something, you'd think that it's the last thing I'd want to think about, let alone identify with. That's how the conscious mind thinks of it. But no, the psychology is very important, like we've been saying all along here. You can't negate the psychology. It's fatal. Because some of these psychologists have discovered things that are bloody very, very important. Paradoxical as they sound. Well, life is paradoxical. Does anyone ever want to work out what is really going on in this world, or they just want to, say no to psychology and that's it? Well, I'm not one of those people anymore. So back to the point. You see this big club, you see these big boots, they've been, running roughshod over your identity, sometimes majorly so, and you're crushing your will. And the parents have been molding you into something that they feel that they would like. And then you learn to fawn, right? It's called fawning, because you'll be destroyed if you don't. So over the years, you do a lot of things, and observation of children proves this. They do a lot of things in order to lower the anxiety so that their parents will like them. Well, what this has all helped. The superego is helping you do this. It's developing and developing in certain ways where you will become pliable, you see, to the tyrant, so the tyrant will start to smile on you and abuse you slightly less. But all the time in your consciousness is a rage, right? A terribly suppressed rage against these affronts. Now, this is a legitimate emotion, which is why it will have a lot to do with Jung's shadow complex later on, right? Because it's legitimate. If it was not legitimate, that would be something different. But no, these are legitimate emotions, but you suppress them. Then you start hating yourself for the suppression because your conscience says you should express this hatred, but of course we can't, right? The whole dynamic of the family constellation, the whole voice of the superego prevents you. So there's already tension from suppressing legitimate emotions. Delinquent children suppress it less, but that's why they're delinquent. Other kids develop tics and weird behavior that is sort of, you can tolerate it in the family, but most family members don't like it, but they don't know where it comes from. The bad wedding and all of these other tics. But it's just something you'll accept because subconsciously the parents know what this is all about, but they don't consciously recognize it. It's a really, 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 really weird dynamic that only psychologists are really interested in. So there's this burning rage. So then by the time that the superego is being fully developed, what you've done is really embody these tyrannical aspects of your parent. You become like them. And usually you've even become a lot like the worst of the parents. The one who is the most manipulative, the one whose power you sort of hated the worst. Now, we would say, in a perfect world, you'd want to do the opposite. Being brought up by these horrible parents, you would want to be a person who's totally doing the antithesis. But as we've spoken about before, how do I know what not to be when I'm 4 years old? Life is already arranged that I can't know that unless I happen to have a lot of other family members around me that I can kind of get a handle. But look at the families today. Does anybody know their grandparents? It's not like Italy or Ireland, right? America certainly isn't. In those days, you got healthier people because you had loads of uncles and aunts and grandparents and neighbors around. So that if your parents were a bit flunky, you could at least identify with other people. And this thing that we're talking about, this dynamic would be there, but it would be a lot lower. And then by the time you went to school, you might be able to identify with then more positive heroes. And it would weaken and lower the level of your identification, with these tyrannical parents. But left alone and without any outside influence, which is kind of the way it is today, you're bound to identify with the object of your hate. And then this is a cause of an enormous inner tension, which is going to basically destroy your life and take you into the future, into a lot of other relationships that won't work for you. You see? Because what will happen is you'll start maybe to act like a parent, and wield this inhuman power, but a part of you will observe that you're doing this. It could even happen with your own children. One of the only times that you notice that you're doing this is when you yourself have children. And you notice that, my God, I'm repeating these same patterns. My dad or my mom used to do this or play these games. But now you're so caught in it that without therapy and without, some serious contemplation, you're not going to be able to change. And then you get caught into that, compulsive dynamic. This happens all the time to people and they have no idea what's going on. They can't explain it like we've just done. So you get these rotten families time after time after time falling into the same trap. And then the parent grows up to be super nice to the grandkids. They were bloody horrible to their own children. The whole thing is so horrific,
Yeah, you'd mentioned the word fawning earlier, and it reminded me of what's known as the 4Fs. And so I was studying a bit of trauma responses in the past, and so you have 4 ways to react to these kind of things. To say repeated traumas from, say, more tyrannical parents over time who are crushing your individual will and maybe embodying this will to meaning. And so the 4Fs are, you could have fight, flight, fawn, or freeze. And you see these different types of how people react to each of those with it, exactly like with it. So you have this sort of the schizoid type, maybe he's going more into that sort of freezing phase or people shutting down. You get the, the people pleaser, where that fawning's come from. You have the avoidant type, where's the flight, and then you have this sort of aggressive or people trying to overcompensate, which is clearly what the fight response is exactly with it. These things then lead to, as you mentioned, a repressed hatred. And it's that repression goes back into this, it's held in the body once more, as we spoke about. And this leads into the work of sort of like Wilhelm Reich and things, which we'll maybe do a podcast on its own on, because there's a real extraordinary genius there. Can you speak a little bit more maybe about this repressed rage then, Michael? Like, how big of an issue is this? How much rage do children really carry against their parents? Is there any good psychologists you can think of about that?
Oh, well, yeah, Melanie Klein would be the number one, person. Also Alice Miller and so on. Because any psychologist who's noticed, like R.D. Laing would be a big one as well. You see, any of them that have noticed the horrific hypocrisy and how a parent can always justify their horrible action by saying it was for the good of the child. It's for your own good. Or I meant well. Or I was only trying to help. You see, the parent has all the different avenues to justify their behavior. Or I was mistreated myself, so I didn't know any other way. And all the litany of excuses. All of these psychologists who see these clients all the time and who notice that no parent is really that guilty when they should be tremendously guilty, but they're really not, all of these things, they are aware. They're aware of the dynamic. And they've written about it, but very few people read their books. And the rage is all important. It's very substantial. It comes out in all the tics we talked about, plus the delinquency, the fight. You said there, right? The fight, flight. But the fight would definitely be that. And the trouble is that this rage not only causes a great deal of physical ailments, the bulimia, the anorexia. Very few of the people who even treat those diseases that I've just mentioned ever mention to the child that's suffering from them that this is to do with parental rage. That's how bad things are.
100%.
Yeah,
absolutely.
They don't even tell you.
It's absolutely
that's what
essential.
It's all about. So the hatred of the body is merely a living out of the you have internalized towards yourself the hatred that you should be legitimately expressing outwardly. But see, the whole dynamic prevents you from doing that. So hatred has to go somewhere. Anger has to go somewhere. And so what you do is you turn it within yourself. If it's not projected, it'll be interjected. And so even bad eyesight, breakouts on the skin, awkwardness, like a lot of teenager kids have this awkwardness, right? And even some of the more loathsome traits. In the end, this is what they're all about. Until one reaches teenage years and then openly can become an alcoholic or a delinquent or whatever. See, the alcoholism is to subdue the rage, but it's also to subdue your memory. It's to also bring a certain sweetness.
Numb the feeling.
Yes, it numbs the feelings. It anesthetizes them. And it brings a kind of a desperately needed sweetness into your life. But it's also the sweetness of forgetfulness, where you can not think about it. Because otherwise, the upper brain will keep on thinking about it obsessively. And since you have no wise elders to talk to about it, no one wants to know. And everybody's dealing with their own trauma. So if you talk to them, it'll trigger their trauma. And they don't want that. So everybody puts on the Prozac smile and thinks, and censors you. You'll never have this conversation with anybody. We were policing each other nonstop. But one of the biggest reasons why you can't talk about this to anybody else is because that would just awaken in them bad feelings about their parents that they've anesthetized. And so they don't want to, so it becomes a chain reaction. And our entire culture is about trying to process this anger. Yeah, the whole thing.
Yeah. And it's because they're doing it to their own children, which then creates this other psychological barrier of going, in order to recognize what I did to myself, I have to realize how I am damaging my own kids. And this is how this cycle continues to repeat on and on. But
it does.
As you were sort of saying then, so you have the child, you have maybe a tyrannical parent, you have this crushing of their will, and then the will to power sort of takes over, which then they identify with. That leads to them living a more inauthentic life because they're not living according to this will to meaning or are listening to the conscious more. That creates this inner tension, this inner rage, all these things we've discussed. There's different types of breaking out of how this occurs then in terms of bodily symptoms and whatnot. But then this I think is really the key of everything we've been speaking of is it's this buried rage that's coming out in all these different manifestations. Or yes, it's these feelings that they have, this inner hatred that then they try to numb. I think that's what leads to this sort of hatred of the body. And then this is where this philosophy of socialism or of Gnosticism, which all tie together, come from. It's a way to try to escape these emotions, to hatred off your own emotions. And so instead of seeing them as messengers of something greater or as your way out of it, that's what they're actually trying to teach you. They go, that's the source of my pain. This is why I hate myself. This is why I hate the material world. And instead of hating the parent, it's self-hatred. And then you see these other symptoms like, the cutting and the bulimia, as you mentioned, and all these other sort of sources. But yeah.
You can hate yourself, you see, for not striking back at legitimate evil. Yeah. This is the twisted logic of the superego. This is the contract we have for what we call sanity. Your conscience screams out that you should have fought back, but you were innocent and you were young and you were vulnerable and you were weak. And so you hate yourself for the weakness. Now, somebody who hates themselves for their weakness, don't you see, is going to identify subliminally with the power that the parent had. And that's why they then go on to be a bit of a bully, a bit competitive, a bit overbearing. And then when they get into relationships, they can be a bit boorish and tyrannical, you see, because inwardly they were very upset that they were so compliant to their evil parents. And so they learn to hate weakness. And so to show that they don't want to do that again, they then become quite defensive. The word is armored. And you're right. It has been pointed out by people that the armored type who shuts himself down from legitimate feeling is more likely to then hate the earth, hate bodily existence, hate pleasure, and start subscribing to these ascetic practices, which will only lead you finally, as you say, to Gnosticism and to supernaturalism and a disdain for the living and for the biophilus. Absolutely.
And it's kind of like, they say to themselves, why did I experience this as a kid? It must be because there's something wrong with me. It's because I was a bad child. And all I need to do is be more good, be more like, or listen to the demands of the superego even further. And so they double down. And so they double the mistake. And they end up on this sort of path of just continually getting more and more into it with it, being
this
more
is
of
the
crowd.
fawning. The fawning type does this. And often you see, you're not the only child. What happens if the parents themselves were fawning on another child who's fawning on them? And you're observing it. You're the bad child in the family. But you find out that the other child who just sits there and does everything that the parent wants, they get all the attention, they get all the little gifts and prizes and approval. Eventually you're going to learn, I need to be like that. I need to go along. I'm suffering too much for being an individual. So what you'll do is you'll hate individuality. And you become more conformist. You'll know that there's a thing called individuality, but as you grow up, you won't like it. You'll see it as a problem. Of course you will, because the child who wasn't an individual, who gave in to the will of the parents, has got loads and loads and loads of goodies and all this bloody approval. You see, and we were mimicking animals. Everything is based on mimicry. The whole superego is mimicry. You're embodying the parent and you're identifying with their power. And you almost have no choice. And the more constricted the constellation, the more you're likely to do that. As I said, the only way to not do that is when you have a lot of other family members around you go, they're not, your mom and dad are idiots. Then you'll start thinking like that and that'll save you. Right? When you have other adults saying, don't listen to your dad, he's a drunk, he's a gambler, he's a loser, right? That's good. That's fucking great. So then you'll go, is that right? Then I need to look up for something more heroic, and you'll find it. But no, the American family today, most families, they don't want you knowing other grandparents and other uncles. This has all happened for a reason. It's all called adultism. So that they can have total dominion over the ones that they're already under. They already have the dominion, but they want it more. And the tyrannical family will want it even more. Just in the same way you've heard of the many, many, many case histories in true crime where an evil husband will cut off for his wife. She'll never be allowed to see her parents or friends. You know that, right? You've heard that?
Yes. Yeah,
The same
absolutely.
dynamic. Or a cult leader.
Psychopaths isolate. Yeah.
That's it. Cult leader will do. This is no different than what I'm talking about. This is all open now. People can know this in their own life stories. But that's very, very essential. If the psychopath wants to keep, the power going, they will make sure that you don't have levity or you're not able to have any objectivity at all with what's going on. And you just live in that cage.
That's this sort of atomization of society, which the architects of control are trying to engineer more.
Right.
More, with these smaller and smaller families with it, you break them down further. You don't have these larger extended then sort of networks to help you sort of see through this sort of tyranny. But it also reminds me of what shadow work really is. When we are speaking about this rage, if you really want to try to get through it and awaken this will to meaning more, you've got to feel that rage once more. And I think you described it as the blue flame of anger, which I always really liked. That always really stuck with me. And so a lot of people think of anger and rage. These are bad or negative emotions. How do you see these, Michael? How are these more maybe tools of communication from the archetypes or wherever way you want to take it?
Oh, yeah. Well, the legitimate emotions, you see, are stored in the body. So my personal sort of journey with that is that through body work, through proper conscious body work like Rolfing and bioenergetic work, this is how you deal with it. It's not so much that you're going to let these emotions arise in your mind. That's intellectualizing it.
Feeling it.
The author Yanovs and others have realized that you can't talk your way to health, in the Freudian way. Not that it doesn't help. It does help. But a really serious person is going to want to have to then, go for bioenergetic work. Yeah. And then let the body do the speaking and read up on that subject, which is when you have to get into your Alexander Lowens, and your Wilhelm Reiches. And then I took that further in my work into this movement and started taking up the connections that Jung's shadow is best seen as the body. I think this concretizes it and makes it less abstract for people. So, and it makes sense anyway, because we are so locked in the head that the thing that is unknown to us, the thing that's pushed into darkness, is the body itself and the body language and the feeling that's trapped in the nerves and in the nervous system, and in the cells and in the myofascia. So, we have a guest on who calls it somatology, the soma, the logic and the meaning of the body. And this was pioneered by George Grodak and then later by Wilhelm Reich. So I'm a big fan of their work. Reich started off as a Freudian. He started off as a communist, but he soon learned to go way beyond both of those. And it became, a genius in his own right, very misunderstood. But again, he's like one of these Velikovsky types who all his theories have been proven time and time again. But unfortunately, we live in an armored world. We don't just have armored people, we have armored cultures. So he was always somebody who was fighting the system, and his ideas still haven't really truly been absorbed by the masses. And it's causing a lot of pathology because the psychotherapy that he was more into was this kind of body work in which he believed deeply in bioenergy and orgone and how this is suppressed through life. And he broke the Freudian model down into a somatic model, where the id, the unconscious, is really the core of the body from which the libido and energy comes. Then the middle sections, which include the musculature and myofascia, and then the surface, which is the ego. So he had a very unique breakdown, not so much a model, but he brought the model more and more to the physical, to the phenomenological, almost getting rid of the model completely. And that was his great achievement.
I remember last time we spoke a little bit about, Gnosticism and the roots of sort of how it started, and it was a lot of use of psychedelics and things, eating mushrooms out in the middle of the deserts with it. Do you think there is a way to use psychedelics to do a kind of shadow work and in a way properly where it's healthy and it's sort of, supervised or whatnot? Or do you think do you see it as all bad psychedelics, or what's your opinion on them roughly with it?
Oh yeah, I have no time for it personally. I think it's all bad, and always have. And I've had a lot of experience, observing it with people a lot. So I have no time for it at all. If it might help in one area, it causes a lot of other pathology in another area. So you might convince yourself that it does this, but you're not seeing some other negatives that it's doing at the same time. So yeah, I don't follow the whole world's fascination with it at all, and think it can only lead to harm. Personally,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I remember seeing some studies about, I know it's becoming more of a big thing in America where they're using MDMA and therapies like that with it for, veterans with PTSD and stuff like it. But I was just curious, but you're just thinking, yeah, no, cut that off. Do it the natural way
Yeah.
with it. There's no need for these external substances.
No, and not if you were doing the right type of psychology. If you're not doing the right type of psychology, then of course naturally you're going to have less good methodologies that might seem to work in the short term. This is what will happen. But see, America's brilliant for leaving out the good stuff and finding lesser good ways of dealing with things, but it's really chasing your tail. America is compulsively trained to look for anything so that they can leave the real psychology at the door. So it doesn't surprise me that they go into 101 different areas and that they over publicize it, because I already know ahead of time what they're going to do. They'll favor anything and everything except psychology. Yeah. And that's why you've got your hippie movement growing up, and behaviorism, and all the isms and ologies that America has thrown up, and the West in general, is entirely to avoid the true, down-to-earth psychological. Just as they've done, to avoid the real philosophical. They came up with their materialism and their reductionism and their scientism. It's all the same. It's all the same forces behind it.
Yeah, yeah.
So I don't have any part. I don't have any faith in it, and would not never ever counsel anyone to ever do those things. Never.
Mm-hmm. That's good. I'll maybe carry on a little bit more of the article, and we'll just sort of keep the flow going with that.